Hello, everyone. Here we are. We're going to find out who the Lord has chosen as the next king of Israel. So let's get going with 1 Samuel 16. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you." Now remember, a heifer is, I believe, a female cow. "And say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I'll show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. Always a good thing to do. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I've rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Remember that. We look at what people look like and we think it means something. It doesn't. The Lord is looking at hearts. And he's weighing hearts, okay? He's not looking at what people look like. That's inconsequential. It's flesh. It's going to die. All right. So let's read that one again. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't consider his appearance or his height, for I've rejected him." This is when he was looking at Eliab, who I'm not sure who Eliab is, but Eliab was standing there, and Samuel was like, "Boy, surely that's the one." And God said, "Nope, don't be looking at his looks or his height. I've rejected him." The Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." You know what? I'm going to go back here. When he read Samuel, by his side comes sacrifice. Okay, forgive me. I'm straying away because I forgot this one line. They said, "Do you come in peace?" The elders of the town trembled when they met Samuel. "Do you come in peace?" "Yes, I come in peace. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons. Okay, so Eliab is one of Jesse's sons. Okay, so he's looking at that one going, "Oh, God, that's got to be the one." And the Lord's like, "Nope, nope, nope." Then Jesse called Abinadab, another son, and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord hasn't chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by. That's Shammah, Shammah, Shammah. But Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" Because he knows apparently the Lord has put it on his heart that it's going to be one of Jesse's sons. So he's confused. "Are these all the sons you have?" "There's still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He's tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So the very baby brother who was out there tending the sheep, he's a shepherd, and he had red hair, by the way. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed in the presence of his brothers, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. David was Jesse's youngest son. This is all the line that Jesus Christ is going to come out of. Samuel then went to Ramah. Now, the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendants said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyra." Remember, the stringed instrument. "He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you'll feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I've seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyra. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So this is where David is going to gain entrance into the palace. So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I'm pleased with him." Now Saul doesn't know that David's been anointed to be the king, does he? To replace him. Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyra and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. Do you see what it says here? Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul. So God sent that particular harassing spirit to Saul because he was mad at Saul, and he removed his presence and sent him a harassing spirit. Now, I don't want any of you to think that God does stuff like this to you if you displease him. That's not what's happening. Now, the enemy will fight against you if you're a Christian and you're pushing in, you're pressing in, okay? But God is not going to sick evil spirits on you. But in this story, with this king who disappointed the Lord very much and made the Lord regret that he had appointed him, he sent a tormenting spirit to Saul. So David would take up his lyra and play, then relief would come to Saul. He'd feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. All right, 1 Samuel 17. Now, the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Sokoh, S-O-K-O-H, in Judah. And I want to make one statement here. David, who was anointed to be the replacement for Saul, the king, he was going to be the king of Israel, was sent into the palace in shepherd's clothes. Okay? So my point is, and I learned this many, many years ago, the Lord often will place you somewhere that you are not dressed for the part yet. You grow into it. Okay? So, and you'll know what I'm talking about now, and you can probably look back over your life and see times where the Lord will put you into the palace in shepherd's clothes. And it doesn't look like it's right that you're there, but it is right that you're there. And you will grow into that king, okay? I also want to make an aside. Last night when I was talking to you about obedience is better than sacrifice, and I told you about the young girl who snuck out of her bedroom window and her friends attacked her, threw her in the trunk and lit her on fire of their car. The scripture that I was thinking of that came to me when I read that story was, there is safety in obedience. So forgive me, I was applying that story to a different scripture, the one we were reading, obedience is better than sacrifice. When we're going to come across the scripture that I really was talking about, which is there is safety in obedience, and there certainly is. And that poor young girl was disobedient and was not safe ultimately. Okay, so back to this story. David is now in the palace. He's been anointed by Samuel, the great prophet in Israel. He's in there in shepherd's clothes with his lyre, his stringed instrument, to soothe Saul, because Saul can't sleep because he gets tormented at night by a spirit that the Lord has allowed to torment him because the Lord's not with Saul anymore. So there he is, And Saul is pleased with him. He's a wonderful player of instruments, and as you'll see in Psalms, he's a wonderful songwriter. Okay, so he had the music that would help Saul sleep. All right, so 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Soko and Azekah. And I think you can understand how these things must be spelled based on the other spellings we've heard. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. Now we know a cubit is 18 inches. So we're looking at 18 inches times 6 is what, 48, 104. So he's got to be 8 feet tall, something like that. And a span, I'm not sure how much a span is. He had so maybe he's 10 feet tall, but he's huge. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor, which means it had the little scale look. Scale armor of bronze. Remember, bronze is heavy. It doesn't melt easily in the fire like silver and gold. Weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, Greaves. Those are the shin plates. And a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. So this guy is huge and is wearing heavy armor and has heavy weapons. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects and serve us." Because remember, Saul has set them all free from all the oppression around them. They're not under the Philistines anymore, but they're still warring with them, okay? Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, which we just saw, who was from Bethlehem in Judah, which we just saw. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old, so Jesse's very old now. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab. Remember, God rejected Eliab. Tall and handsome, Lord said, "I've rejected him." The second, Abinadab, Lord said, "I've rejected him too." And the third, Shammah. No, he's not the one either. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So he's still serving his old elderly father, Jesse, by going back and tending the sheep, but he serves Saul in the evenings playing his lyra. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I don't think it's lyre or lyre. I don't like saying it like that. So I'm just going to say lyra, Lyre. All right, I might be Lear, I don't know. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. So every morning and night, Goliath came down threatening them and said, "Send me a man, come on. If you can beat me, then we'll serve you. If you can't, you're gonna serve us." Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah," we know what an ephah is, it's a big amount, "of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines." So Dad is worried. He wants to know how his sons are. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out. Well, of course, because an ephah is a bushel, which is like, what did we say, 56 pounds or something? Loaded up and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear because he was a huge giant. Now, the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He'll also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." How many of us would go slay a Goliath so we could not have to pay taxes anymore? David asked the man standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness?" So he's mocking David, like, "You're just a stupid shepherd boy. Who'd you leave your 3 sheep with? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Sibling rivalry. "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the man answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he's defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." That's faith, folks. That's faith. Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Because remember, he had his little slingshot. Now, you remember some of those warriors that used slingshots. Do you remember that description, that they could hit a hair on someone's head with a stone? That's how good they were. All right. So Goliath says, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods, meaning the Philistine gods, Ashtoreths, Baals. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I'll come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals." Wait, let me say that right. This very day, I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there's a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. Remember that, please. The battle is always the Lord's. The battle is the Lord's. And he will give you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. Hit him right here and it sunk in. Boom! So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. Pride goes before fall. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath, and after he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is, because he doesn't know he's Jesse's son. He doesn't know David's been anointed as the next king of Israel. He doesn't know any of this. He just knows that David was brought to him to play the lyra and drive the demon away," okay? As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." Okay, chapter 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. So Saul's son, Jonathan, and David got like that, just fast friends. And he loved him as himself. Now, you will find in the camps of some groups of homosexuals will swear up and down that this is a homosexual relationship. I promise you it's not. Okay? I mean, homosexuals were not regarded well, and the Israelites knew that this was against God's command, okay? And if you remember, homosexuals brought down an entire tribe, Benjamin, because of the rape and murder of that man's concubine, okay? God doesn't like sexual assault. He took a whole tribe out, save a few, for sexual assault and murder, okay? So, my point is David and Jonathan, don't ever let anyone tell you this was a homosexual relationship. It most certainly was not. That would be against everything the Israelites stood for. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. So this was one of those friendships, and if you've had one, you know what they're saying here. It's just one of those friendships, and I've had this before, where that person is like you. I mean, there's just such a bond, okay? And it's very pleasant to find a friend like that. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Because remember, David was in shepherd's clothes. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing and joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. I think timbrels are tambourine type things. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? He doesn't know he's going to get the kingdom. And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. So now his jealousy has come on him, and this evil spirit is helping him to be even more wicked. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. A lot of people are going to be jealous of you because they see the Lord is with you. It happens. It happens in families, okay? I mean, my daughter has been viciously jealous of me for 30 years because of my relationship with the Lord. But, I heard Joyce Meyer, who I don't follow Joyce Meyer, but years and years and years ago, before just years ago when I was a younger Christian, she said, I'm sick and tired of people being jealous of me for my relationship with the Lord, but they're not willing to do what I did to get it. Bingo. All right. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I'll not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." So he's hoping David will get killed in battle. But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now Saul's daughter Michal, or Michal, I'll just say Michal because I hear a lot of people calling her that. It's Michal. But now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. "I'll give her to him," he thought, "so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." So Saul's really turned his heart away from David. So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." Then Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king likes you and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law.'" They repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him and went out and killed 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins. So twice the amount. He said 100 and David brought 200. They counted out the full number to the king so that David might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Jealousy. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. All right, so we're going to leave it there, and tomorrow we'll pick up at 1 Samuel 19, and we'll go on from there. I love you very much. Have a wonderful evening. And remember, trust the Lord in all things. Wait upon him, okay? Don't rush. Don't lean to your own understanding. Remember that there's safety for you in obedience. And remember to praise him, okay? And don't you worry about a thing, because everything is going to be all right. I promise. The Lord promises. I love you. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.